Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And now I turn it over to Rachel.
Hi, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, whoever is here. I'm excited to see new faces and old faces and familiar faces. Hi. And what we're going to do is, can you hear me? Just can you like mark or say like this that you hear me, just to make sure? Thank you. So we're going to delve, thank you. We're going to delve right in, okay? There's this problem in storytelling when we tell stories that if the story is familiar, it's hard to surprise the audience. Like, let's say we're 4th of July is around the corner in quarantine time. Let's say we're talking about the American Revolution and we're talking about Valley Forge and everything that happened there. It's very easy to assume that, of course, the Americans were going to win. It's inevitable, it's predetermined, it's preordained, because we already know the ending. And it's easy when we read about difficult moments during the war, battles that were lost, and many battles were lost, moments of despair, to dismiss them and just, yeah, yada, yada. It's just an illusion. We all know that there's going to be a victory at the end, right? But the truth is, that's not how it was experienced, and that's militarily not how it actually was. Same thing when we read the Tanakh. For example, we read the story of Yosef and his brothers. We read about a group of men who, upon seeing their younger brother, are beating him up violently, tearing off his clothes and throwing him into a hole. I think you'll agree with me that we don't feel the same horror we would feel if we read it anywhere else, because we already know it's going to work out and then everything's going to be okay. So some of our innate horror, some of our just shock when we see violence is already bled out of us by familiarity. And I think that when we look at Megillat Ruth, especially year after year after year after year, and we read a story that basically says this young widowed Moabite girl became the great-grandmother of King David, we treat it as if it's a perfectly normal, to be expected thing. Yeah, but let's say the sentence again for a second. A young Moabite girl, widowed and impoverished, became the grandmother of King David. This is insane. This is not to be expected, especially because the two key moments that made her the great-grandmother of David HaMelech hinged, in a sense, on her behaving in a highly unconventional way. Let's look together at the first moment. Rabbi Adam, could you share the first box in the source sheet? The first page? Thank you. I can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Sorry, I gave you the wrong thing.
Yes.
2 seconds. Stop share. Sorry.
Looks like a good lesson also.
Here you go. Let's see if we can get this right. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So can you scroll down a little bit so we can see the entire first passage? Thank you, perfect. So let's look at the first moment when we see Ruth choosing to follow Naomi. I'll just recap quickly. I assume we have some familiarity with it, but I'll recap quickly. Naomi, the wife of a rich man of Bethlehem, Elimelech, goes with her husband to Moab in a year of famine. Her husband dies there. Her sons, who married Moabite girls, die there. She loses all her fortune. She remains this widowed woman without any support, and she wants to go home to Bethlehem. And at first, her two daughters-in-law, those Moabite girls who are also widowed and without support, try to go with her. So Naomi presents them with reasons why they shouldn't. And I'd like to read it together, and then I'd like to ask you to tell me. So let's look closely at the text and tell me, what reasons does Ruth have not to go with Naomi? But first, let's read it quickly in the English. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Turn back, each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you. as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that each of you finds security in the house of a husband." And she kissed them farewell. They both cry and say, "No, we shall go, we shall go." But Naomi says, "Turn back, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I any more sons in my body who might be husbands for you? Turn back, my daughters, for I am too old to be married. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I were married tonight and I also bore sons, should you wait for them to grow up? Should you, on their account, debar yourself for marriage? Oh no, my daughters, my lot is far more bitter than yours, for the hand of the Lord has struck out against me." They broke into weeping again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law farewell, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, Naomi says, "See, your daughter-in-law has returned to her people and her gods. Go follow your sister-in-law." Before we continue, let's unshare, Rabbi Adam. Okay, can we unshare? And I'd like to open this discussion for you. There's not so many of us, so it's easier to have a discussion like that. Feel free to unmute yourself. And what reasons does Ruth have not to go with Naomi, in your opinion?
I'd like to share something that Shira Heck-Kohler brought out the other evening with the last session that we had with her on Ruth. And Moab was not a really holy, far from being a holy place. And I think my take on that is that realizing that Ruth decided to throw her lot in with Naomi, and let's see what happens. And maybe Orpah didn't have the same sense, so she turned back.
So you're giving a good reason as to why Ruth does go with Naomi, but can you try and say why Orpah decided to stay?
From what I got from Shira's comments, maybe Ruth was more sensitive to the depravity in her hometown, and Orpah was not.
I would take what you're saying, but I would twist it a little bit, and I would say that most people are not sensitive to what's going on in their hometown, right? Because this is what we're used to. What familiarity breeds a certain desensitivity to what's going around us, and we'll get back to that later in the class.
It breeds contempt. Maybe that's what.
Well, I don't know. Let's leave contempt out of it for now.
I don't want to monopolize.
No, it's okay. I just want to say that you can look at it as a negative thing, that Orpah is insensitive to something wrong, but you can also say that she feels the comfort of familiarity.
Yeah.
And there's definitely a lot at stake, and moving across the world, well, for them it was across the world.
I was shocked when Shira was pointing out how some commentators, I mean, they really dish whatever on Orpah and put Ruth on a pedestal. And I think that's an exaggeration on both ends at this point in the story.
So you know what, I'd like to do the opposite. I would like to argue that Orpah is actually making a very reasonable decision, because let's look again at the text, Rabbi Adam, if you don't mind.
I'm with you.
Yeah. No, let's open the text for a second and see it there, if that's okay. Thank you. If you look at what Naomi herself is saying to her daughters-in-law, she tells them, go to your mother's home. Go back to the womb. Go back to the place where you're family, right? Also, go and find security, find menucha, find peace. If you look at verse 9, where? In a house of a husband. In other words, if you go back to your parents' house, you will have the chance to do the same thing you did before, which is marry into a new family and have a household of your own, maybe children, maybe a life. Then she tells them, go back. After Orpah goes back, she turns to Ruth in verse 15 and say, go back like your sister-in-law who had returned to her people and her gods. Ruth and Orpah, by following Naomi, are tearing themselves apart from everything that was familiar to them, everything that was home to them. If we think back to the customs of the ancient world, and frankly, not just the ancient world, also they're going against the grain of what's expected from women in their society. What's expected from a woman is that she is either under her husband's authority or under her father's authority and protection. So now that they have no husbands, why would they go with their mother-in-law, who can offer them neither familiarity, neither parenting in the way that their origin family can, and neither can she offer them any promise of a future or protection moving forward? By deciding to go anyway, Ruth is doing something that goes against the customs of the time, against her self-interest, in a sense, against common sense. And the only reason she gives, or not even she, the only reason that the story gives, if we look at verse 16, but Ruth replied, "Do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. When you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you." When Naomi saw how determined she was to go with her, she ceased to argue with her. Note that the text here doesn't actually give us a reason. Ruth doesn't say, because I love you, because I care about you, because I feel bad in this country. I feel that there's something wrong. I'm feeling something wrong in my mother country. She just says, no, I am going with you. All those things you said, I'm not going to follow them. I'm not going to go back to my home, my country, my God, my people. I will decide that now my people, my home, and my country are with you. And this is, and I want to really emphasize that, because this is, it's easy to lose our sensitivity to it because the story is already familiar and we already know where it goes. But it's a really perverse kind of choice in the deep sense of the word, not in a negative sense of the word, in the sense that she's going against the grain of what's expected from her, of what makes sense. It almost makes me think, forgive me for the girly comparison, but it almost makes me think of Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, who proposes to Elizabeth Bennet, even though his honor and duty and even his own judgment compel him to not propose to her. So everything tells her, don't do it, but she does it. And the word that the text uses here is to cling, lidvok. Here it is in verse 14, Yudaled. I'll read it in Hebrew. Vatisena kolan, vativkena od, vatishak orpa lechamota, and then verut devkaba, and Ruth clung to her. And this word sends us straight back to Genesis 2, to the moment when Adam sees Eve for the first time and says, this time flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones. And then the editor intervenes and say, and it's in the same, it's below the text we read before, hence a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife so that they become one flesh. So here Ruth, instead of going back to her parents and then from there to a husband and building her own family and becoming one flesh with another man, is using the same verb, the same almost attachment to cling to a woman who can't offer her any of the normal things people in her position should want: security, protection, and the potential for continuity. Thank you, Rabbi Adam. Let's go out of the text, okay? Thank you. So this is a highly unconventional and unorthodox behavior. And of course, this is not the last time Ruth behaves in an unusual manner. Later, she meets Boaz, and Boaz is very kind to her, and he says, may God bless you, God, that you came to rest under his wing. You can look later at the text. We're not going to delay on that right now. May God bless you. But Naomi and Ruth are looking at the situation, and Naomi says, you know, resting under God's wing is all nice and good, but we need to get Boaz to offer you to rest under his wing. So she instructs Ruth to do something truly shocking, really, to go and sneak up on Boaz, lie down lemargelotav, at his feet. And here, forgive me for being a bit coarse, but Lemargelotav, sometimes in biblical Hebrew, is used as a euphemism to other body parts. And I'll leave it at that. So she goes and lies there at his feet, and when he notices her in the middle of the night, she beseeches him to take her under his wing. If you look later at the text, she's basically taking the words he said, "May God that you came to rest under his wing protect you." She says, no, you take me under his wing. This is unusual. This is not normal behavior for a woman. If it wasn't for Ruth doing that, she wouldn't have become King David's great-grandmother. So going back to what I said in the beginning, it may seem normal to us and to be expected to us as readers, as seasoned readers that already saw the story, but the truth is it's kind of shocking. And the fact that she became David's grandmother was not obvious, was not inevitable. In fact, it depended on her acting in ways that were totally out of, beyond the norm of her time and even our time to some extent. Now, lest we think that Ruth is the exception to prove the normative rule, that, she's the black sheep in the Davidic dynasty, her story, especially the story of how she sneaks on Boaz, pretty much repeats or echoes or copies or adapts two previous stories about women who were great-grandmothers of David HaMelech, both of which boldly went and got the pregnancies they wanted, to some extent against the will or knowledge of the man involved, and forced their way into the genealogy that later leads to David. Let's look at them for a second at the text. Rabbi Adam, sorry, I have to ask you again to share it. Let's go down, more down. Yeah, thank you. David's other grandmothers. The first, we don't know by name. The first is the daughter of Lot and the mother of Moab, whose name disappears. We don't know it. We never hear it. And after God destroys and devastates Sodom, she, along with her other younger sister and her father, are the only people to survive the devastation as far as she knows. And they go to a mountain and they sit down and they look at all the ruins. And the daughter says in verse 31, "And the older one said to the younger, 'Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to concert with us in the way of all the world. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and let us lie with him, that we may maintain life through our father.' That night they made their father drink wine, and the older one went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she rose." I want to point out that the word velo yada b'shochva u'bekoma appear not exactly in this configuration, but they appear also in the story of Ruth and Boaz. There, the person who doesn't know is not Boaz, it's rather he tells her, "Hide here till the morning, Ruth. Stay here with me till the morning and then leave so no one will know that you were here, lo yada ish." But and nobody knows that she lay there. Nobody knows that she then got up and left. The words are resonant. We're not going to delay on it now because we don't have much time, but the source is in box 2 above. You can look at it later and compare the wording. Yeah, you can see I highlighted those words that appear, but we're not going to go into it now. Let's go on to the next grandmother, David's next scandalous grandmother. And that's the famous Tamar, who was married first to one of Yehuda, the Yehuda's sons. And then when he died, was married to his second son. And when he died also, Yehuda was kind of reluctant to marry her to his third son, and basically tried to kind of make the problem disappear by telling her, stay at your father's house, let my son grow up a little bit. And then it became clear that he's not really going to let her marry his son. So Tamar decides to take action, much like Moab's mother and like Ruth with Naomi's encouragement later. Tamar decides that she will become pregnant and she will continue the family line that she wants to continue. And she does it, we don't have to read the entire description, by dressing up as a prostitute, sitting at a place where she knows Yehuda shall pass. And then when he comes to her, and the wording here is interesting, let's look at verse 16. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, "Here, let me sleep with you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. Again, lo yada. He didn't know, the same words from before. And so he slept with her and she conceived by him. Then she went on her way. She took off her veil and again put on her widow's garb. And from that pregnancy that she had at that moment, were born David's, Zerach and Peretz were born, and the Davidic dynasty, or the genealogy that leads to David, started. And when the Tanakh, here, let's get out of the text for a second. When the Tanakh repeats a similar story and with similar words 3 times, we know that we should pause and listen, that there's some message here, that there's something that the story is trying to tell us. And before we delve forward and try and figure it out, I'd like to pause here and ask you, what do you think? What do you make of it? Just by your own common sense or whatever, why do you think it's important for the Tanakh to emphasize like this, through this weird pattern of nonconformity, that David's grandmothers were unorthodox, unconventional, very bold women, in your opinion? Please unmute yourself if you want to share a thought. Anyone?
With the examples of Lot's daughters and Tamar and Yehuda, were those looked at, would Ruth have any knowledge of them and look upon that as a precedent? And also in Ruth, I don't think the text is as explicit in terms of an actual sexual act. I mean, you made an aside regarding, there are some commentators who think it's other than feet, that it's the male organ. I saw that in Robert Alter's comment, but apparently that's a minority view. So what really did happen on the threshing floor?
Yochi Brandeis, the Israeli author and teacher, has a really interesting book called, I don't know if you know it, Sheva Imahot, 7 Mothers, with 7 essays about 7 biblical women. And she makes a very interesting point about this scene on the threshing floor. She points out that, yes, the text really pretty much says that nothing happened, and yet you can't read it and not feel the sexual undertones.
It's a tease.
Because of the words. Because the words that are used are vatishkav and chile, which is also a word that's used for sexual relations. Vayeda, to know, which of course is also a word for that. Vayaker, which is also a word for that. Margelotav, his feet, which, as I said, is a euphemism. So it's the text is making very, very sure that we understand that even if nothing happened at this moment, this is what the negotiation is about. This is not a man and a woman having a conversation about matrimony in Victorian England, sitting in the drawing room, and drinking tea in between conversations about the weather. These are people who know what's going on. They know what's on the table or on the floor, so to speak. It's really about continuing the line through becoming one flesh, if I go back to Genesis again.
Okay.
And it's interesting that both Ruth and Yehuda and Tamar and the mother of Moab, we don't need to, I'm not saying that they knew about each other and emulated each other. I'm saying that the way the storyteller, the biblical storyteller, shapes the stories is clearly meant to draw our attention to the similarities. We, the audience, are supposed to look at it and be like, there's a pattern here. And it's kind of funny to say that somebody conforms to a pattern of nonconformity, but this is exactly what Ruth does, right? She conforms to the pattern that was established by Lot's daughter and Yehuda's daughter-in-law / lover, Tamal, in boldly taking initiative against the grain. In Moab's case, it was also against, it was incest. There's something really disturbing there. And yet saying, no, I'll shape the reality as I see fit, regardless of expectations, regardless of norms. And the truth is, I ask what it means and why it's important, but the truth is David himself answers the question for us by living up to this very unorthodox legacy. What's the first public encounter we have with David? Not small conversations or whatever, a public moment that we have of David. Does anybody want to say?
Are you leading up to Bathsheba?
Long before that. The first moment we meet David, I'll put it this way, the first person, the entire people of Israel meets David.
Oh, with Goliath.
Exactly, with Goliath, right? And at that moment, let's envision it for a second. There's this giant, and he's clad in armor, and he's holding all these weapons, and there's the description in Samuel is like really emphasizing the weight of the armor, the weight of the weapon. He's a massive war machine, let's put it this way. And he's standing there. And David comes, and everybody tells him, no, don't go. And King Shaul says, you're a boy. You're not going to win. Why go and do that? And David gives this heroic speech about how God helped me to protect my sheep from the lion and the bear, and now God will help me protect us from Goliath. And you can practically hear the eye rolls in the crowd. They're like, oh my God, yeah, God helped you save from the sheep. Great. Look at this mountain of a man. Is that really what you think is going to happen here? And the king gives him his own armor. King Shaul gives David his own armor. And everybody expects him to fail. And let's admit it, if David would have engaged with Goliath in hand-to-hand battle, which is clearly what Goliath was expecting, he probably would have failed. But David, in that very first public appearance on the stage of national history, disregards the terms of engagement, upends everybody's expectations. He takes off the armor, and instead of engaging in the hand-to-hand battle everybody assumed he will engage in, kills Goliath from afar. And Rabbi David Wolpe, in his book, David, the Divided Heart,
I read
points out that when David throws the stone, there's this bizarre moment where the stone hits Goliath's head, but instead of making Goliath fall backwards, it makes Goliath fall forward. And Rabbi Wolpe says, what's that? Why is David falling forward and not backwards? And he says this is, in a sense, a literary way for the story to emphasize that David achieves unexpected results. That when David does things, he appends how we expect things to go. Just like Goliath falls forward, so later when everybody assumes that David will just remain on the run from Shaul, he says, you know what, I can't win. And he goes and joins the Philistines, totally surprising everybody. And later, when he becomes king, and king of all of Israel, after the tribes that weren't under him, that were under Shaul and Shaul's son, come and say, be our king, everybody is waiting to see where will he put his capital. Will his capital be in Judea, saying that he's first and foremost a Judean king, or let's say in Givah, where Shaul used to be king, saying that he's taking over the national project, but perhaps disregarding his own tribe. You can imagine that there are people who were invested in both options and expected and were ready to pounce on him with anger no matter what he chose, right? So what does David do? He goes and conquers a foreign city and makes his capital there. He doesn't play by the rules of what people expect of him. When his own wife, Michal, daughter of Shaul, expects him to behave with decorum, he goes and dances in the street in front of the Ark of the Covenant. David doesn't do what people expect him to do. And sorry, I can't hear you, Henry. Do you want to unmute yourself?
I mean, throughout Sefer Shmuel, there's this whole tension between David and obviously not only Shaul, but Shaul's offspring, that you know, that runs throughout.
Yeah, and to a great extent, and this goes a little bit beyond the scope of what we can discuss in a 1-hour lesson, but I will say that since you kind of led the way there, that to a great extent, the difference between Shaul and David is exactly David's flexibility. You know, Rabbi Adam, could you share the text again? I'm sorry. Are you here? Thank you. Could you
I
go
am
down?
here.
Yeah, thank you. Could you go down well below, I think to the last page. We're going to jump ahead a little bit. Yeah, thank you. I'll give one example of what I mean when I say that Shaul, that the thing that really is remarkable about David is his flexibility, or his refusal to accept reality as it is and just follow the norms and the expectations and what everybody else expects him to do. I want to show how different from Shaul he is. So on the eve of Shaul's death, Shaul is desperate. He is about to go into battle with the Philistines, and he knows he cannot win. He sees their camp. He sees the numbers, and he knows he doesn't have the ability, and he has no access to God. So he does something illicit. He goes to a Baalatov, to a witch, to bring up Shmuel's spirit. And Shmuel is very angry. Shmuel says, and look at the second source in this box from Shmuel 1:28. Shmuel said to Shaul, "Why have you disturbed me and brought me up?" And Shaul answered, "I am in great trouble." So I want to say, I think the translation here is problematic. What he says is, "Tsar li me'od." It's very narrow for me. I am in dire straits, if you want to say. And we can really hear the feeling he's conveying here, that the world is collapsing on him and he has nowhere to go and no way to push out. And he says, I am in dire straits. The Philistines are attacking me, and God has turned away from me. He no longer answers me either by prophets or in dreams, so I've called you to tell me what I am to do. And Shmuel answers very harshly and says, yeah, God abandoned you because you didn't do what he wanted. He told you it will happen. And then he continues and says, further, the Lord will deliver the Israelites who are with you into the hands of the Plishtim. Tomorrow your sons and you will be with me, and the Lord will also deliver the Israelite forces into the hands of the Plishtim. At once Shaul flung prone on the ground, terrified by Shmuel's words. Besides, there was no strength in him, for he had not eaten anything all day and all night. Now, to his great credit, later Shaul got up and went and stood at the head of his army and died, knowing that that's going to happen. And this takes a lot of courage. But what he didn't do is try and change this reality. He accepted reality as it is. Late in David's life, he faces a very similar situation. He counts the people. He runs a census, knowing that he's not supposed to. And God sends the prophet God to David and says, you will be punished. You have to choose between war, famine, and pestilence. And David says, and look at the first source in box 8, David said to God, Tsar li me'od. It's very narrow for me. I am in great distress. I am in narrow straits. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his compassion and great, and let me not fall into the hands of men. The biblical story doesn't choose words haphazardly. The fact that we hear the same sentence here as we heard in Shaul's story should kind of sound like a, how would I put it? It's like it should ring a bell. It should make us think, oh, is it similar? Is it different? And on the face of it, it's very similar. Both David and Shaul are getting, late in their careers, the message that God is against them, and they accept. Except that while Shaul really did accept and didn't try to fight it, David doesn't. Because later, when David sees the people actually dying in the plague, he calls out. Let's look at the last source. Rabbi Adam, could you roll down a little bit? Thank you. When David saw the angel who was striking down the people, he said to the Lord, I alone am guilty. I alone have done wrong. But these poor sheep, think back to the Goliath story and him telling how great of a shepherd he is. These poor sheep, What have they done? Let your hand fall upon me and my father's house. God came to David the same day and said to him, go and set up an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Arana the Jebusite. And David built there an altar to the Lord and sacrificed burnt offerings and offerings of well-being. The Lord responded to the plea for the land, and the plague against Israel was checked. Thank you, Rabbi Adam. Here, let's go out of the text. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So David, even when God himself tells him what reality is, refuses to accept it. Even when God himself tells him this is how it's going to be, his irreverence towards the way things are, and his commitment to seeing new possibilities of how things can be, right, overcomes his sense of doom and gloom. And this is something, sorry, Rabbi Adam, are you saying something?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Isn't there something where, I don't know if it's Midrash or whatever, where David is given an option, okay, the people are going to get whacked. You got three choices.
Yeah.
So David is showing his control, well, I mean, that's too strong a word, his understanding of the situation and how he can negotiate not the best, but a better outcome than what would have been. And Shaul is totally dependent on Shmuel to pull the coals out of the fire for him.
I don't know if I would say that exactly, but I would definitely agree that, and it's not a midrash, by the way, it's the text there before the part we read. That's exactly the conversation that takes place. I think that you're strengthening what the point we're striving at, which is that David stands out in his refusal to just accept the terms that are given. He makes new options where people see, limits and feel narrow and feel like the walls are collapsing on them. He will burst through. He will refuse to accept that this is it, that this is the end of the story. And he comes by this irreverence, honestly, as we see from his three great-grandmothers, right? From Ruth and the mother of Moab and Tamar, all of them also refused to just accept the reality that was around them and said, no, we will make the reality. We will change things. But the question, I think that the foundational question is it's not enough to point out that there's a pattern of irreverence here. I think that we need to understand why it's important. The Tanakh doesn't tell us things just to entertain us. It makes a point, and it really brings it home by using all those words that repeat themselves in these three female stories about the three women, by constantly emphasizing David's unorthodox ways, if you can put it this way. What's the point? Why is it so important? I have an answer I want to present, but I'd like to hear it. Does anybody want to offer their own insight into this? Anyone? So I'll hop right in.
Yeah, go for it.
One way to look at it, and that's not my preferred way, but I'll put it out there first, is that just from a storytelling point of view, heroes that append things are better heroes. A story about people who live in a status quo and accept the status quo and go on living in the status quo, let's admit it, is a boring story. It just doesn't make for a very good story.
It doesn't get written.
It doesn't get written. There's something about the inner logic of story, what a story is, that requires things to change and challenges to happen. And Joseph Campbell, in his phenomenal book, The Hero of a Thousand Faces, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, where he compares stories from all over and all times and shows certain patterns that repeat themselves. He says that the hero is always he's always a hero of becoming and not of things already become. A hero by essence is someone who is challenged to go beyond the norms and change things, and that's what starts the plot going. Otherwise, there's no plot. The problem, of course, is that the Tanakh is not just a storybook. If it was just a storybook, I'd say, okay, fine. This is why it emphasizes irreverent characters, because they make for better stories. But the Tanakh is trying to teach us something. And here, the logic of story, the way stories emphasize irreverence, can perhaps lead us to a deeper point. But in order to understand this deeper point, let's take a step back and look at the history for a moment. David is king. Shaul and David after him become kings at a very tumultuous and critical moment in our history. The book of Judges leading up to it showed that we need centralized government, that living without centralized government is horrible. But as we know from the books that will follow, from the rest of Shmuel and Melachim, kingship is problematic. Centralized government has a lot of problems. Even if you don't talk about evil leaders, I'm not talking now about people who are evil or malicious. Just the way centralized government works, the way things work when they become institutionalized, is that they become, is that a word, atrophied? Is that a correct way to put it? Atrophied?
No.
Things become, no? Like stone. What's the word?
Or is it entropy? Definitely not atrophy.
Sorry. Israeli here. Things become like stone. Things become, certain institutions are created and then they just become the norm.
Right.
And then people just learn to live with them, so they're not going to challenge them. Also, everybody's welfare becomes tied in with the strength of the central government. So going against the central government, if it does something wrong, can be presented as immoral and wrong, because you're going to undermine the government that protects us all, and we're all going to suffer because of that. Does that sound familiar? It's issues that have been on human consciousness for millennia, on our mind for millennia.
The American Civil War.
Yeah, a lot of moments in history when people criticized the way things are, the kind of knee-jerk reaction of the institutions, of the establishment, and of good people, not malicious people, good people, was, yes, some people suffer, some people are abused, there's certain miscarrying of justice here and there, but really the system as a whole does so much good, so why challenge it? Now, that's true always, but to a great extent, the whole project of the Tanakh, the whole project of the Jewish covenant with God, is to offer us a different way to build society. Because our anchor is not supposed to be the good of the people in terms of food, security, etc., even though all of those are important things. Our anchor is supposed to be the covenant. Our anchor is supposed to be God's call to live up to a higher moral standard. And once government becomes centralized, once power becomes accumulated in the hands of the government, the king, his ministers, his clients, etc., in the Roman sense, we can lose sight of it. Yoram Chazoni, in his book, The Philosophy of Hebrew Scripture, talks about it at length. It's in the source sheet. We don't have time to go into it. I strongly recommend reading it. But he says that in the ancient East, the big empires were the empires of grain in Mesopotamia and by the Nile, Egypt. Those were the big empires that were built on collecting grain, and then as taxes, and then in return, giving protection against, pirates, against attacks from outside, against years of famine. If you think about the Yosef story, the centralization and the collection of food as a way to protect people. But all of that also meant that any one person in this system, in this kind of closed circle of farmer, tax collector, soldier, king, priest, farmer again, wouldn't challenge the way things are, because that's just the way it is and everybody's welfare is invested in it. And the challenge that the Israelites are facing as they're starting to consolidate and to form a centralized government in the book of Shmuel, in the days of Shaul and then David, is how can we reap the benefits of a centralized government without losing our ability to remain loyal to a higher moral standard, even when it's inconvenient, even when it goes against our self-interest, even when it goes against common sense, much like Ruth did by and by, going back to the beginning, going against her self-interest, against what made sense, against what was customary to pursue what she felt she should pursue. So how do we do that as a system? And the David story and the emphasis on David's flexibility and the way he doesn't allow himself to just fall into the kind of expected norms and walk the path, rather constantly breaks free from it and makes different choices and reshapes reality, offers us a way forward. It tells us that what we need in order to have a centralized government but not become like the empires of grain in the ancient Near East, like Hobbes's Leviathan, right, where everything is justified by the need of having a strong government. The way to do it is to have leadership that is irreverent, unorthodox, unconventional, and follows in the footsteps of Ruth and Tamar and Moab's mother. But this is only one layer. We have to take this a little bit deeper here again. Because, yeah, okay, so there's leadership that's irreverent and unorthodox and unconventional and doesn't allow things to sit and all those stuff. That's great. But who is the greatest threat? Who can become the greatest threat for morality in a government, in your opinion? I can't hear you. I'm sorry. Henry, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, the leadership.
The leader himself,
Yeah.
right? It's not so, okay, so the leader might be for his own interest and in his own pursuits like battles and marriages and whatnot, unusual and unconventional, but the most important thing is that the leader has to be irreverent towards himself. The leader has to be able to look at his own past and say, this was wrong, I'm breaking a new path now. This, I'm taking us in the wrong path, I'm going to jump away. And this is, of course, something that David is very famous for. And let's go back to the source sheet. Sorry, Rabbi Adam. It's in, I'll tell you exactly where, a moment, sorry. In box 7, page 6. When David sins with Bathsheba and Nathan comes with his blistering rebuke, David famously said, I stand guilty before the Lord. Chatati la Hashem. No excuses, no attempts to blame someone else as King Shaul before him did when he was accused of things. He accepts. He says, yes, it's true. And if we look at the Yoram Chazoni quote at the bottom of this page, ultimately it is the qualities, I'm sorry. Pause for a second. I want to point out that this Davidic admission of guilt and ability to change course is something that he inherited from his great-grandfather. We talked about his great-grandmothers. Let's talk about the men in the dynasty, lest you think that they are conventional types. Let's talk about Yehuda, who was about to execute Tamar when he found that she was pregnant and thought that she whored herself. But when she told him, discreetly, not publicly, who do you think the baby is from, and had the proof that it's from him, he said, Sadka mimeni. He said, right, she's right. And humiliated himself by not punishing her since he recognized that she is right. I also want to point out that in a more mild way, but still important, also Boaz, when Ruth came and said, take me under your wing, using the words he used before to say, may God take you under his wing, Boaz also could say, well, like Ploni Almoni later in Megillat, well, it's not convenient for me. But no, Ruth is not offering her rebuke in the same way that Natan is offering to David, but she is telling him, you are challenged to rise to the occasion, and he does rise to the occasion. So we do see that there's a certain repeating pattern in the story here not only of bold and unconventional women, but also of men who, when they notice that they should do something differently, do it. And as Yoram Chazoni said, sorry, now I'll read this quote, ultimately, it is the qualities associated with Judah that are vindicated by the narrative as being most suited for ruling over men. And this despite the fact that Joseph's political abilities are recognized to be superior. Chazoni shows how the difference between Shaul and David is only another repetition of a theme that runs throughout the Tanakh of comparing two types of leadership. And why is Yehuda's leadership the preferred leadership? The ability of the ruler to humble himself and change his ways is seen as the only hope of correcting the direction of the state when it's off course. In other words, when we understand, we can close the text, thank you. When we understand that the big danger of centralized government, despite all the glorious thing it offers us, is that it will become a justification of itself. And even if it's unjust and wrong and corrupt, we will let it be and forget all the other standards that we're supposed to rise to because it's convenient, because it's safe, because it helps people, because it's with common sense, because we have a duty for it, because our honor is invested in it, etc., etc. Our self-interest is invested in it. David and his great-grandmothers and his great-grandfathers remind us that as long as we're careful to choose leaders or to follow leaders who have the ability to refuse to accept the expected, the normative, and even their own past, we might be inoculated against those dangers of centralization. I'll put it differently. As long as our leaders are people who do not feel the weight of what was and what is to the extent that they can no longer seek what can be, then we have hope. But of course, all of that is nice and good, but most of us, truly most of us are not national leaders, right? I mean, we may be leaders in our own right, in our own families and surroundings, but we're not national leaders. So what does it all mean to us? And what can we take from it? And I want to suggest that it's particularly important for us to remember that as we're about to celebrate receiving the Torah. Because just like centralized government can become institutionalized and become a status quo and become something that we're so invested in and so comfortable with that we no longer challenge it and no longer wonder if it's just or unjust and if there's a way to make it better, so can our life with Torah. Meaning, when we celebrate receiving the Torah, we celebrate our connection to a long and glorious tradition. We celebrate our connection to the covenant. But the covenant is supposed to be a living thing, a living relationship between us and God, where we constantly strive to do better. But isn't it easy when we're part of tradition, when we're part of certain norms of practice and norms of study, to just kind of forget about the challenges and forget about needing to improve things and just become invested in the way things are and the past to an extent that we don't notice when we need to rise to the occasion and do something new and use the tradition behind us to propel us to greater things. And perhaps this is why we need to read Ruth and Shavuot, because on the holiday when we celebrate receiving the Torah, we need to remember not to allow the Torah to become what centralized government can become, what any big institution can become, a status quo that stops us from imagining new possibilities, throwing new stones, creating new things. And I guess this is what I want to take from Megillat Ruth this year, that while we appreciate being part of tradition, part of society, part of modern civilization, we all need to sometimes have a little bit of the irreverence and the creativity of the young Moabite girl who, through sheer power of will, became a great-grandmother of the greatest king in our history. And on that note, Shavuot Sameach.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you for your creativity and maybe a little irreverence in terms of how you saw the text. We really appreciate it. Thank you for the classes that you gave, the conversations that we had about Ruth, and we look forward to enjoying your learning after Shavuot as well, and for a long time to come. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Shavuot Sameach. Enjoy. Make sure to follow all of our activities on 929 English and all the activities coming up. And we look forward to learning with you, studying with you for many, many years to come. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Yaakov,
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Henry.
likewise.
Shavuot Sameach.